The salt-laced wind was a constant companion here, a tireless breath against the glass dome of my observatory. It whistled through the eaves, a low, mournful sound that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat in this remote corner of the world. I lived on an island community where the ferry only runs once a week, a solitary sentinel against the vast, indifferent ocean. That isolation suited me. It meant fewer distractions, fewer voices to interrupt the quiet hum of the universe I sought to decipher. My nights were spent hunched over consoles, the glow of monitors painting my face in shifting hues of green and blue. The air in the control room was dry, metallic, smelling faintly of ozone and stale coffee. My fingers, calloused from years of fine-tuning delicate instruments, moved with practiced precision across worn keypads. Every dial, every switch, every flicker of light on the complex machinery felt like an extension of myself. This was my sanctuary, my life's work. My meticulous routines were the only anchor in a sea of cosmic uncertainty. I had been tracing faint radio emissions from the void between galaxies for nearly a decade. Most of it was noise, the cosmic background radiation, the static whispers of creation and annihilation. But I sought the anomalies, the statistical outliers that hinted at something more than just random chaos. A tiny deviation, a peculiar spike in a spectral graph, could unravel entire theories. That was the thrill, the quiet obsession that fueled my endless vigils. Tonight felt like any other. The rhythmic thrum of the cooling systems vibrated through the floorboards, a subtle tremor against my worn boots. Outside, the moon was a sliver, offering little light to the turbulent sea beyond my window. My gaze was fixed on the primary display, a sprawling tapestry of faint blips and squiggles, each one a distant echo from light years away. I sipped lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste a welcome jolt against the creeping weariness. Then a flicker, not a new one but one I had marked days ago as an intriguing, yet likely spurious data point. It was a faint, persistent signal from the intergalactic medium, a region of space thought to be almost entirely empty. I had dismissed it initially as an instrument glitch, a stray reflection from some passing satellite, perhaps even a terrestrial interference. But my protocols demanded verification. Every anomaly deserved a second, a third, a hundredth look. I ran the filtering algorithms again, tighter parameters this time, stripping away layers of background noise. The signal remained. It was weak, barely discernible above the cosmic hiss, but undeniably there. My brow furrowed. No star systems, no nebulae, no known sources of energy to account for even the faintest emission. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool glass of the monitor. The signal wasn't just persistent, it was structured. This was the crucial detail, the one that made the hairs on my arms prickle despite the cool air of the room. It wasn't random bursts, not the chaotic signature of a supernova, nor the elegant pulse of a distant pulsar. My fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly as I adjusted the gain, bringing the waveform into sharper relief. The patterns resolved themselves further, sequences, repetitions, a mathematical elegance that defied any natural origin I knew. It was impossibly old, traveling across unimaginable gulfs of space and time, yet its structure was pristine, coherent. I checked my instruments, calibrating them again, running diagnostics. Everything was nominal. No errors, no malfunctions. The observatory was functioning perfectly. The signal was real. My mind raced, trying to fit this impossible data point into the framework of established astrophysics. It didn't fit. It shattered the frame entirely. Who or what could be sending such a signal and from where? It felt less like a discovery and more like an intrusion. My throat felt dry, a sudden tightness constricting it. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was parched. The hum of the machinery, once a comforting lull, now seemed to pulse with an unfamiliar menace, a low, resonant throb that mirrored the unsettling rhythm on my screen. This wasn't just a groundbreaking discovery. It was a revelation that threatened to unravel everything I understood about the universe. What kind of intelligence could survive for so long, across such distances, to broadcast a message that defied the very laws of physics as I knew them. The salt-laced wind had stopped being a mournful sound. Now, after the signal, it felt like a persistent whisper against the glass dome of my observatory, a dry, rasping breath that carried an implicit judgment. My own heartbeat, once a familiar rhythm, felt like a frantic, desperate drum, echoing the relentless thrum of the servers in the room below. I hadn't left the console in what felt like days, maybe weeks. The ferry only ran once a week, a distant thought now, a relic of a life before the impossible, before the void had spoken. My eyes, gritty and bloodshot, scanned lines of spectral data. This wasn't just old, it was ancient, unfathomably so. A signal born before the Earth had cooled, before the first single-celled organism had stirred in the primordial soup. It originated from the vast, empty gulf between galaxies, a region thought to be utterly barren, devoid of even the most diffuse matter. And yet here it was, a precise, modulated pulse. I had always prided myself on my rigor, my dedication to scientific method. Every anomaly, every statistical blip, I chased with methodical precision. But this defied every known principle. My custom algorithms, designed to sift through cosmic noise for faint, natural phenomena, kept flagging the same thing: structure. Not the random, chaotic bursts of a dying star, nor the uniform hum of background radiation. This was patterned, intricate. The first few days were a blur of caffeine and code. I ran every filter, every statistical test, convinced it had to be an error, a glitch in the equipment, a harmonic echo from some terrestrial broadcast bouncing off the ionosphere. I cross-referenced with every known astrophysical catalog, every astronomical event, every obscure theoretical model. Nothing. The signal remained pristine and unyielding, a perfect, impossible sequence. My fingers ached, stiff from hours spent hovering over the keyboard. The air in the observatory grew thick with the smell of stale coffee and ozone from the humming machinery. My stomach gnawed, but the thought of food was repulsive. I started to isolate individual packets of the signal. They weren't simple binary. Each pulse wasn't just an on-off state. It carried a complex modulation, like a tiny, vibrating string. When I plotted these modulations, intricate fractal patterns emerged. They weren't random. They had a logic, a recursive elegance that made my breath catch in my throat. It was like looking at a snowflake magnified 1,000,000 times. Only this snowflake was speaking. My initial attempts to map these patterns to known mathematical series failed spectacularly. They didn't conform to prime numbers, Fibonacci sequences, or any of the universal constants I fed into my analysis. They were something else entirely. A new language, perhaps. I dug into theoretical linguistics, into information theory, into cryptology. I built new programs, specifically designed to look for non-human linguistic structures. The machine groaned, its internal fans whirring louder, as if struggling with the sheer volume of data I was feeding it, or perhaps with the implications of that data. The patterns became more unsettling the deeper I delved. There was a periodicity, yes, a rhythm, but it wasn't a simple one. It shifted, subtly, across vast stretches of time, yet always maintained a profound internal consistency. It was like a piece of music that evolved over eons, each note perfect, each transition seamless, yet utterly alien to any human scale of comprehension. My head began to throb behind my eyes, a dull, persistent ache that mirrored the signal's rhythm. My sleep, when it came, was shallow and fragmented, haunted by the abstract beauty and terrifying implications of what I was uncovering. I'd jolt awake, convinced I'd heard a new modulation, a new whisper in the salt-laced wind. The truth began to solidify in my mind, a terrifying, crystalline certainty. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. It wasn't a cosmic accident. The sheer complexity, the precision, the non-randomness, it all pointed to one impossible conclusion. This was intelligent, deliberate, and it had been broadcasting for longer than our sun had existed. A shiver traced its way down my spine despite the warmth of the server room. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. My skin prickled. What kind of intelligence could survive for so long? What kind of entity could craft a signal that traversed such impossible distances and time frames, carrying such intricate, layered information? Then, in a late-night breakthrough, my newest algorithm, designed to identify emergent properties in complex systems, finally clicked. It wasn't just patterns. It was nested patterns, structures within structures like an infinite Russian doll. Each layer revealed a deeper, more profound level of organization. And at the very core, a repeating motif, a fundamental unit that defied any mathematical or linguistic interpretation I could conjure. It was a symbol, perhaps, a glyph, a single, irreducible concept. I stared at the screen, at the glowing, pulsing representation of that core motif. It wasn't symmetrical in any way I understood. It wasn't organic. It wasn't inorganic. It simply was. And the more I looked at it, the more I felt a profound sense of wrongness, a fundamental disharmony with everything I knew about reality. It was like looking directly into a wound in existence. My breath hitched. What was this fundamental unit trying to communicate? My own heartbeat, once a familiar rhythm, felt like a frantic, desperate drum, echoing the unsettling resonance that still vibrated in my bones. I had slept little. Each closed eye brought not darkness, but a vast, cold expanse pregnant with a geometry that defied human perception, yet now felt horribly familiar. My instruments, once my sanctuary, had become accusatory monoliths. They had delivered a truth I was unprepared for, a truth that fractured the bedrock of my understanding. The signal was not a random burst, nor a natural phenomenon. It was structured, impossibly ancient. My scientific models offered no explanation. My peer-reviewed papers were worthless against this. I needed a different kind of knowledge, something outside the sterile glow of my monitors. Something older. The island community, ferry only runs once a week, had always been a quiet refuge, a place for contemplation and the uninterrupted gaze skyward. Now, its isolation felt less like peace and more like a trap. I descended from the observatory, the path slick with sea spray, my boots crunching on loose gravel. The wind tore at my coat, pushing me forward or perhaps trying to hold me back. The air smelled of brine and damp earth, a familiar scent that now held a faint, unsettling undertone, like something long buried had stirred beneath the soil. My destination was an old, gabled house near the small, disused docks, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. It belonged to the antiquarian, a solitary figure who had lived on the island for decades, rumored to possess a collection of texts spanning obscure histories and forgotten lore. I had avoided him until now, content with my cosmos. But the cosmos had sent me a message I couldn't decipher with logic alone. I knocked. The sound was swallowed by the wind. I tried again harder. A faint light flickered within. The antiquarian, a stooped figure with wispy white hair and eyes like polished stones, peered out. "Marcus," he rasped, his voice a dry rustle. He rarely used my name. "Unusual for you to call, not looking for new telescopes, are we?" "No," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. I'm looking for something else, something old, very old, myths, legends, anything that speaks of patterns, structures that defy natural order." His gaze sharpened, a flicker of something unreadable in his deep-set eyes. He opened the door wider, allowing me into a cramped entryway choked with leaning stacks of books. The air was thick, heavy with dust motes dancing in the faint light from a single gas lamp. Every surface was covered. Maps rolled tight, brittle scrolls tied with twine, leather-bound volumes stacked precariously. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight. "Patterns," he echoed, leading me deeper into the labyrinth. "The world is full of patterns, Marcus. The tides, the stars, the folly of man. Alien, something that feels like a language but isn't. A design, perhaps." He ran a gnarled finger along a row of bindings, thick with dust and disuse. The things that predate even our myths. The pages, when he laid it on a small, wobbly table, were thick, almost like bark, filled with faded, angular script I couldn't read. But it wasn't the script that arrested my attention. It was the diagrams. My breath hitched. My fingers trembled as I reached out, tracing the brittle surface. There, on a page yellowed with impossible age, was a complex interlocking pattern. Not a drawing, not an illustration, but a precise, intricate diagram. It looked like a constellation, yet no star chart I knew but the structure. The way the lines intersected, the specific angles, the asymmetrical repetition. It was a mirror. Not exact, but undeniably a reflection of the abstract data points I had been mapping from the signal. My mind reeled. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't some ancient culture's whimsical art. This was knowledge. Forbidden knowledge somehow transcribed onto these ancient pages centuries, millennia before my instruments had ever turned skyward. A hot flush spread across my face. My stomach clenched. What is this? I managed, my voice strained. Where did this come from? The antiquarian leaned closer, his breath smelling of decay and old paper. It's one of the older pieces. He was found in a sealed vault beneath an abandoned factory on the mainland. A relic from a time when men understood that the night held more than just stars. They understood that some things simply are, and they left their warnings. He tapped a specific point on the diagram, a nexus where several lines converged. This, they called the unraveling point, the place where the fabric thins. My gaze snapped back to the diagram, then to the antiquarian's face, the unraveling point. The signal's data had highlighted a similar nexus, a focal point of intense energy, a singularity of information. My scientific mind screamed for explanation, for rationale. This wasn't science fiction. This was history, a history humanity had forgotten or perhaps deliberately buried. The wind outside howled, rattling the single pane of glass in the window, a sound like a moan. This wasn't just a myth. It was a premonition, a warning. Who were they? And what did they know that we had forgotten? But the primitive fear that had been gnawing at me, a cold parasite in my gut, finally coiled tight. The antiquarian's shop, once a dusty haven of forgotten lore, now felt like the threshold of something I shouldn't have touched. He cleared his throat, a dry rattle in the quiet room. The texts speak of a rectification, the antiquarian murmured, tapping a gnarled finger on the diagram. A correction, not of errors but of existence itself, a reordering to a truer state. I tried to process his words, but my mind was a churning sea. Rectification, correction. The signal, the data, the impossible patterns that had defied every known law of physics. It all pointed to an intelligence so vast, so alien, it made the stars feel small. I left the shop in a daze, the late afternoon sun a sickly yellow through the island's perpetual haze. The walk back to my solitary laboratory, nestled on a remote cliffside of the island community, ferry only runs once a week, was a blur. Each crunch of gravel under my boots seemed to echo the unsettling phrase, a reordering to a truer state. The chill of the sea wind did nothing to clear my head. My lab, usually a sanctuary of controlled chaos, felt different, subtly, profoundly wrong. I'd left my coffee mug, a chipped ceramic relic, on the right side of my desk. I was meticulous about such things, a habit born of long hours of focus. But there it was, sitting squarely on the left, nestled amongst a stack of spectral analysis printouts I hadn't touched in days. A minor detail, easily dismissed. I must have moved it myself and forgotten. My exhaustion was playing tricks. I picked up the mug, my fingers tracing the rim. It felt unfamiliar, as if it had always belonged there on the left. I placed it back on the right, where it belonged, then went to make myself a fresh pot. The clatter of the kettle on the stove sounded too loud in the sudden quiet of the lab. Later, poring over the signal data again, trying to find a flaw, a rational explanation for the antiquarian's unsettling diagram, I saw it, or thought I did, a flicker. In my peripheral vision, the corner of the lab where the wall met the ceiling seemed to waver. Not a tremor, not a vibration, but a subtle, impossible bending. As if the very geometry of the room had momentarily warped, only to snap back into place the instant I turned my head directly to it. My breath hitched. I stared, unblinking, at the pristine white paint, the sharp, orthogonal lines. Nothing. My eyes were tired. Long nights of staring at screens. That was it. The dreams began that night, not the disjointed, fragmented narratives of typical sleep, but something far more invasive. They were not my dreams. They felt like data streams forced directly into my consciousness. I was standing in a place that wasn't a place, surrounded by colors that didn't exist, shapes that defied 3 dimensions. There was a sense of immense pressure, not physical but informational. A profound, crushing weight of knowledge that my mind struggled to comprehend. I saw lines, not drawn on a surface, but existing as fundamental constructs, shifting, twisting, correcting themselves. And at the heart of it, an almost imperceptible hum, a vibration that resonated deep within my bones. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but felt with my entire being. A resonance, a tuning. I woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat, the hum still vibrating in my skull. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum. I pushed myself up, my muscles aching, my head throbbing. The hum faded, leaving behind a persistent echo, a low thrum that felt lodged behind my eyes. I stumbled to the small kitchen, pouring a glass of water with shaking hands. The water tasted metallic, flat. The next morning, the distortions continued. I walked into the main analysis chamber, ready to dive back into the signal's frequencies and stop dead. My chair, a heavy, bolted-down swiveling model, was facing the wrong way. Not just slightly askew, but rotated a full 90 degrees facing the wall. I always left it facing the console, always. This was not a minor oversight. This was deliberate. Had someone been in here, but my lab was locked, isolated. The ferry only ran once a week and I hadn't seen another soul in days. I slowly approached the chair, my hand extended, hesitant. I spun it back around, the squeak of the mechanism loud in the silent room. As I did, I caught another fleeting glimpse. The monitor screen, off and black, seemed to ripple. Not a reflection, not a trick of the light. The glass itself, for a fraction of a second, warped inward like disturbed water, showing a distorted, impossible reflection of my own face before snapping back to its flat, inert surface. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was real, or my mind was coming undone. The distinction felt dangerously thin. That night, the dream returned, more vivid, more forceful. This time, I wasn't just observing the shifting geometries, I was part of them. My own form felt less solid, my limbs stretching and compressing in ways that should have been agony but were merely different. The hum intensified, a symphony of incomprehensible frequencies. I felt a presence, vast and ancient, not hostile but utterly indifferent, systematically adjusting the fabric of everything. It wasn't speaking in words, but in pure concept, in an overwhelming sense of purpose, a purpose that involved me. I thrashed awake, tangled in my sheets, gasping for air. My skin crawled. The air in the room felt heavy, charged. I could still feel the phantom stretching of my limbs, the echo of the impossible hum. I got out of bed, my legs wobbly, and walked to the window. The moon cast a pale, sickly light over the tumultuous sea. The waves crashed against the cliffs, an endless, indifferent roar. Was this what the signal was doing? Unraveling my perception of reality, piece by piece preparing me for a truth I was never meant to grasp. What was this correction doing to me? I left the shop in a daze, the late afternoon sun doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep in my bones. Rectification. Correction. The words echoed, a sinister mantra, twisting the impossible patterns of the signal into something monstrous. My carefully constructed world, built on empirical data and verifiable laws, felt like a house of cards buffeted by an unseen storm. The logical next step, the only one I could conceive in my desperation, was to seek out someone who had dared to look beyond the veil of accepted knowledge. My research led me to the name of a former academic, whispered in hushed tones among the few who remembered him. He had been banished from the institutions of learning years ago, his theories deemed too outlandish, too dangerous for polite discussion. They said he had seen too much, understood too little, or perhaps understood too much. He lived in an island community. Ferry only runs once a week. A place of deliberate isolation, a final retreat from a world that had rejected his truths. The journey was a blur of churning water and gray skies. The ferry cut a slow, deliberate path across the choppy expanse, leaving behind the last vestiges of the mainland. The air grew heavy with the scent of brine and decaying seaweed, a smell that seemed to cling to the very fabric of the island itself. My stomach churned with the motion of the boat and a deeper, more profound anxiety. What would I find there? Another cryptic warning, or perhaps a reflection of my own spiraling fear? When the ferry finally docked, the island seemed to sigh, exhaling a damp, cold breath. The few inhabitants I saw moved with a quiet resignation, their gazes distant, as if constantly scanning a horizon I couldn't perceive. I asked a dock worker for directions to the reclusive former academic's dwelling. He merely pointed a calloused finger towards the highest, most desolate bluff, his eyes holding a mixture of pity and warning. "He sees things, that one," the dock worker muttered, "things best left unseen." The path to the dwelling was overgrown, a winding track swallowed by tenacious weeds and salt-blasted shrubs. The wind, unhindered by trees, whipped around me, carrying the incessant cry of gulls and the distant crash of waves against jagged rocks. The house itself was a squat stone structure, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the churning sea. It looked less like a home and more like a tomb, a place where sanity went to die. A faint, acrid smell, like burnt paper and something metallic, seeped from beneath the warped wooden door. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing a gaunt figure silhouetted against the dim interior. The former academic was a man ravaged by something more than just age. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, and his eyes, though clouded with a perpetual weariness, held an unnerving intensity that seemed to bore directly into my own. He didn't invite me in, but simply stepped aside, leaving the entrance open. The interior was a chaotic mess of stacked books, yellowed manuscripts, and strange, intricate diagrams tacked to every available surface. The air was thick with dust and the same unsettling odor I'd noticed outside. I introduced myself, my voice feeling strangely small in the cavernous space. "I've made a discovery, a signal from beyond our galaxy." I tried to sound scientific, detached, but my hands trembled visibly. "It's structured, impossibly old, and it suggests a fundamental change." He turned from me, his gaze sweeping over the chaotic display of his own research. Change, or a return. He picked up a brittle, leather-bound volume, its pages filled with indecipherable script and unsettling symbols. "You speak of a signal, Marcus, an echo of something that predates even the concept of time." My throat tightened. "Rectification," I managed, the word feeling like a stone in my mouth. "The data implies a correction to the laws of existence." The former academic's head snapped towards me, his eyes flaring with a sudden, terrifying clarity. "Correction," he repeated, the word now a venomous hiss. "They call it correction, but it is unraveling. A great unraveling, Marcus, not a restructuring. They seek to unmake what is, to smooth out the ripples that we and all of existence represent." He took a step closer, his breath smelling of stale tea and something vaguely metallic. "You've glimpsed the edge, haven't you?" My skin prickled. This was no madman raving. They are concepts, principles, an older order disturbed by the accidental bloom of existence. They are the architects of oblivion, Marcus, and they consider our reality a flaw in their grand, eternal design, a mistake to be erased. His gaze fixed on me, unwavering. "The signal you found, it's not a message, it's a tremor, a sound of the chisel against the foundation of everything." My chest tightened, a crushing weight pressing down on my lungs. I felt a sudden, desperate urge to flee, to run back to the ferry, to pretend I had never heard a single word. But the words had already burrowed into my mind, intertwining with my own data, forming a horrifying tapestry of impending doom. My hands clenched, nails digging into my palms. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. The diagrams on the walls seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision, the symbols pulsing with a malevolent energy. "What can be done?" I asked, the question a plea against the inevitable. He gave a dry, humorless chuckle, a sound like gravel grinding together. Done. You ask what can be done against the very fabric of non-existence seeking to reclaim its own, against entities that predate thought, Marcus. We are less than dust motes in their grand scheme. We are an aberration, and aberrations are to be corrected. He turned back to his chaotic collection of books, his eyes distant once more, as if already seeing beyond the present. The true horror, Marcus, is not that we are insignificant. It is that our insignificance is not enough to save us. They notice us. My breath hitched. The implication settled over me like a shroud. If they had noticed us, if our very existence was a mistake in their primordial design, then what chance did we truly have against such an incomprehensible force? What did noticing truly entail for something so vast and alien? The silence, a suffocating blanket, had followed me from the console. It still clung to the air in my small laboratory, a thick, palpable presence that seemed to absorb all other sounds. My breath, shallow and ragged, felt like a foreign invasion in the stillness. The implication, that chilling whisper of recognition from the void, not lifted. What did? What could it even want with us? I had spent the ensuing hours in a fugue state, staring at the complex algorithms on the screens, their familiar patterns now seeming utterly alien, mocking. My hands, usually steady, trembled with an insistent tremor. The wind outside, usually a comforting lullaby in this isolated island community, ferry only runs once a week, now sounded like a mournful sigh, carrying secrets I was not meant to hear. But the fear, however paralyzing, was eventually eclipsed by a familiar, stubborn drive. The astrophysicist in me, the part that craved understanding above all else, began to stir. I had to know. I needed to know. What had I truly detected? What had noticed me? Days blurred into a relentless cycle of caffeine, stale air, and the relentless hum of my equipment. My vision blurred from staring at the monitors. My head ached with a dull, persistent throb behind my eyes. I abandoned the conventional parsing methods. The signal wasn't behaving like any astronomical data I had ever encountered. It wasn't a pulsar, not a quasar, not even the faint echo of a primordial black hole. It was deliberate. I started looking for patterns not in frequency shifts or amplitude modulation, but in the intent behind the noise. I layered spectral analyses, searching for recurring motifs, not as mathematical equations, but as structural echoes, like a complex musical score played across dimensions. My fingers danced across the keyboard, driven by an instinct I couldn't explain, a hunch that felt less like scientific hypothesis and more like a primal urge. I felt less like a scientist and more like an archaeologist unearthing a forbidden text. Then, a subtle shift. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but a slow, insidious dawning. I had been listening for a message, a code, something to be decoded, but it wasn't a message in the way we understood it. It was a resonance. It began subtly, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the air, a vibration that seemed to bypass my eardrums and resonate directly within my skull. I checked the equipment, but all readouts were normal. Yet the sensation intensified. It felt like a deep chord being struck, far beyond the range of human hearing, slowly, gradually building. I leaned closer to the main console, my breath catching in my throat. The screens, usually displaying neat, quantifiable data, now seemed to shimmer at the edges of my vision. The complex waveforms I had been analyzing began to coalesce, not into mathematical expressions, but into something else entirely. A structure. It was a language, yes, but not of words. It was a language of pure, unadulterated being. A tapestry woven from fundamental cosmic vibrations, a symphony of existence itself. And I, Marcus, was suddenly, terrifyingly perceiving it. The sound swelled not outwardly but inwardly. It pressed against the inside of my skull, a pressure that was both painful and exhilarating. My vision swam. The air grew thick, heavy with an unseen weight. I could smell ozone, sharp and metallic, even though no circuits were overloading. My hands, still hovering over the console, began to ache, as if the vibrations were passing directly through my bones. Then, the first fragment of understanding pierced through the cacophony. It spoke of inherent flaws, of cosmic imperfections, of the need for an ultimate correction. It was a melody of erasure, a song of unmaking. My head snapped back from the screen, a guttural gasp tearing from my throat. The reverberation in my head intensified, a dizzying, sickening thrum. It felt as though my very atoms were being rearranged, harmonized to an alien frequency. The entity wasn't just sending data, it was speaking, and it was speaking directly to me. Its voice was not of air or vocal cords, but of reality itself, twisting and reshaping the space around me with its intent. And within that terrible song, I glimpsed a purpose so profound, so utterly indifferent to everything I knew that it stripped me bare. It spoke of existence as an error, a glitch in a grander, older design, and it was here to fix it. My skin crawled. The room, my sanctuary, now felt like a cage shrinking around me. The ferry wouldn't run again for days. I was utterly alone with this burgeoning, horrifying comprehension. How could I possibly contain such a truth, let alone fight against an entity that saw all of creation as a temporary, correctable mistake? The implication, that chilling whisper from the void, had begun to coil itself around the very roots of my perception. It wasn't a sound now, not really, but a tremor in the air, a persistent hum behind my eyes that dulled the edges of everything else. My laboratory, once a sanctuary of ordered thought, felt like a pressure cooker, the walls bowing inward with an invisible weight. I paced, a desperate animal in a cage of my own making, the scent of ozone and stale coffee clinging to my clothes. Each circuit hum, each faint click of the cooling systems, seemed to carry a secondary, warped resonance, a faint, discordant echo that wasn't quite right. I tried to work. I tried to immerse myself in the data, the familiar patterns, but the numbers blurred. The lines of code swam before my eyes, refusing to hold their shape. My fingers, usually precise, fumbled on the keyboard, hitting wrong keys, creating nonsense. The air grew colder, even though the thermostat hadn't changed. A shiver, deep and bone-aching, snaked through me, leaving goosebumps on my arms. Then came the visual disturbances. At first, they were subtle, easily dismissed. A flicker in my peripheral vision, like a moth darting past, but when I turned, there was nothing. A ripple in the reflection of the console screen, as if the glass itself had briefly become liquid. I blamed fatigue, the strain on my eyes from staring at monitors for too long. I rubbed my temples, squeezed my eyes shut, and reopened them, trying to force clarity back into a world that felt increasingly smeared. One morning, after a night of fitful, dream-haunted sleep, I found myself staring at my coffee mug. It was chipped, a familiar imperfection, but as I watched, the ceramic seemed to breathe. The chip expanded, then contracted, the surface rippling like disturbed water. My breath hitched. I blinked hard, shaking my head. It was just a mug, solid, unchanging, but the memory of its momentary fluidity clung to my vision, a phantom afterimage. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the porcelain feeling strangely soft, yielding before hardening under my touch. I knew then that it wasn't just fatigue. This was something deeper, something reaching into the very machinery of my mind. The entity wasn't merely sending a signal, it was retuning me, bending my internal instruments to its own alien frequency. The realization curdled in my gut, a bitter taste rising in my throat. I was not merely an observer, I was becoming a receiver, a conduit, and my sanity was the price. The isolation of the island community, ferry only runs once a week, began to press in on me like a physical force. There was no escape, no quick ferry ride to a mainland city, no anonymous crowd to lose myself in. The small community, once a comfort, now felt like a trap. Every face I saw, every brief interaction, felt laced with an unspoken judgment, a knowing glance that wasn't there. I started avoiding the few other inhabitants, retreating further into my laboratory, into the suffocating echo chamber of my own deteriorating mind. The event occurred during one of these self-imposed incarcerations. I was hunched over a printout of the signal data, trying to find a pattern, any pattern, that would make sense of the escalating chaos. I flinched, my eyes aching. They peeled away from the corners, from beneath the console, from the very walls, gaining a tangible depth, a viscous tar-like quality. I scrambled backward, knocking my chair over, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. My breath caught, ragged and shallow. The air grew thick, like breathing through wet wool, heavy with the scent of something metallic and ancient, like rust mixed with cosmic dust. They were things, entities born of the absence of light, yet possessing a horrifying substance. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands into them until stars exploded behind my eyelids. When I opened them again, the room was normal. The lights hummed steadily. The air was clear. The scent was gone, but the chair lay overturned, a stark reminder of my retreat. The reveal was not a sudden burst of insight, but a slow, agonizing creep of understanding. It happened as I tried to reset a malfunctioning sensor. My fingers grazed the cold metal casing, and for a fleeting instant the sensor vibrated, not with mechanical energy but with a living pulse. I felt its internal components, the wires, the circuits, not as inert matter, but as a complex network of sinews and nerves, alive and subtly shifting. It was as if the fundamental property of the object, its very metalness, had momentarily fractured, revealing something utterly alien beneath. This wasn't just a trick of the light or a phantom sound. This was the world itself, the very fabric of existence, showing its seams. The entity wasn't just influencing my mind. It was subtly, irrevocably, altering the laws that govern my reality, starting with the small things. The way light bent, the way sounds carried, the very solidity of matter. My mind was merely the first instrument it was retuning. My perception was being rewired to accept the impossible, to categorize the unclassifiable. Sleep became a battlefield. I would jolt awake, convinced I heard the rustling of impossible wings outside my window, or the low, guttural grinding of tectonic plates shifting beneath my foundation. My skin crawled. I felt watched, not by a single pair of eyes, but by an omnipresent, unfathomable gaze that penetrated the very marrow of my bones. I started leaving the lights on, all of them, a futile attempt to banish the encroaching distortions. The line between what was real and what was merely a projection of my fractured mind became a shifting, treacherous terrain. My hands would clench, my nails digging into my palms, trying to ground myself in physical sensation. But even touch felt unreliable now. The texture of the workbench sometimes too smooth, sometimes too rough, sometimes something else entirely, a viscous, clinging sensation that made me recoil. How much of my world was still my own and how much had already been rewritten? My laboratory, once a sanctuary of ordered thought, felt suddenly like a thin-walled room at the edge of an abyss. I had tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as fatigue, a byproduct of staring too long at the spectral data. But the hum persisted, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated not in my ears but in my bones. I ran a hand over my scalp, the skin prickling. The fluorescent lights above flickered, not consistently but in sporadic, almost rhythmic pulses that made my vision jump. It wasn't the usual electrical fault. I knew the wiring here intimately. This was different, a stutter in the very flow of light. I rose from my console, my chair scraping across the floor with a sound that seemed to stretch and warp, like a rubber band snapping in slow motion. My balance felt subtly off, as if the floor beneath me was a boat deck on an imperceptibly shifting sea. A pen, left precariously on the edge of a stack of printouts, didn't just fall. It seemed to hesitate, to drift downwards with a strange, unnatural slowness before clattering to the floor. My initial thought was a draft, a vibration, anything mundane. But the air was still, and the tremor I felt was not of the building, but of something deeper, more fundamental. I bent to retrieve the pen, and for a fleeting instant, my hand felt impossibly heavy, then impossibly light, as if gravity itself had hiccuped. My fingers fumbled, missing the pen entirely. Outside, the late afternoon light, usually so crisp and clear in this remote place, seemed to have taken on a sickly, bruised hue. I walked to the small window, pushing aside the heavy blackout curtain that usually protected my sensitive equipment from stray light. A lone gull circled lazily, but its cries were muted, swallowed by the strange atmospheric density. The air itself felt heavy, carrying a faint, metallic tang, like distant static electricity. My lungs struggled to draw a full breath. I had installed a series of sensitive atmospheric sensors around the perimeter of my small compound, mostly for baseline environmental data. Now, a quick glance at the monitor showed inexplicable fluctuations. Barometric pressure was spiking and dropping erratically, far beyond any natural weather pattern. Wind speed, though negligible, was being registered from impossible directions simultaneously. And then there was the temperature, a sudden inexplicable drop of several degrees in the span of minutes, followed by an equally abrupt rise. This wasn't weather. This was a disturbance. My gaze drifted further to the distant horizon where the ocean met the sky. The waves, usually a constant, rhythmic roar, seemed hesitant, their crests failing to break with their accustomed power. They slapped against the shore with a dull, wet sigh instead of a crash. Something was muffling the world, muting its natural rhythms. The isolation of this island community, ferry only runs once a week, had always been a comfort, a shield against the noise of the world. Now it felt like a cage, tightening around me. I returned to my main console, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I pulled up the latest data from my deepest probes, the ones designed to track the signal's origin, but something new had overlaid them. A secondary reading, subtle at first, then growing with terrifying clarity. It wasn't merely a transmission anymore. It was a pressure wave, a ripple in the fabric of spacetime itself, emanating from the source. My instruments, designed to detect the most minute cosmic phenomena, were screaming. I calibrated a simple pendulum, a heavy lead bob on a fine thread, suspended in a vacuum chamber. It was a crude instrument but undeniably effective for detecting subtle gravitational shifts. I set it swinging, its arc precise and regular. I watched, my breath held tight in my chest. For a moment it maintained its steady rhythm. Then almost imperceptibly the arc widened, then narrowed, then shifted slightly off its true plane. It wasn't much, a fraction of a millimeter, but it was impossible. It defied the fundamental laws of physics. Gravity, the bedrock of our existence, was wavering. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the console. The hum behind my eyes intensified, a low, guttural growl now. It wasn't just influencing my mind. It was reaching out, touching the physical world. The signal wasn't just data, it was a leading edge, a vanguard. The entity wasn't merely transmitting information across unimaginable distances. It was coming, or perhaps its influence was expanding, a vast, unseen hand closing around my world. My eyes darted around the lab, seeing the familiar objects with a new, horrifying clarity. A stack of old textbooks seemed to lean impossibly, a slight tilt that hadn't been there moments before. A small metal ruler on my workbench vibrated with a low, almost inaudible hum of its own. I walked over, reaching out to touch it. The metal felt strangely alive, buzzing with an internal energy that wasn't electrical. I snatched my hand back, a gasp catching in my throat. This was beyond anything I had ever conceived. This wasn't a discovery, it was an intrusion. And I, Marcus, alone on this remote sliver of land, had pulled back the curtain. What had I unleashed? The hum had become a constant companion, a low-frequency drone that vibrated in my teeth and seemed to subtly warp the air around me. My laboratory, once a bastion of meticulous order, now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a sealed chamber. Every glint of polished metal, every neatly stacked journal seemed to mock the chaos brewing behind my eyes. The signal, the entity, the unthinkable implications, they were no longer abstract concepts. They were a visceral presence, pressing against the thin membrane of my perception. I had to tell someone. I had to make them understand. The determination was a cold, hard knot in my stomach, overriding the pervasive dread that threatened to paralyze me. My fingers, strangely numb, fumbled with the old rotary phone on my desk. The number for a senior colleague, a man whose intellect I had always respected, was etched into my memory. The dial spun with a slow, grinding sound, each click echoing unnaturally loud in the quiet room. A series of distant rings, then a hesitant voice answered. "Yes. This is Professor Davies's office. It's Marcus," I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "I need to speak with him. It's urgent, critically urgent." There was a pause, a rustle of papers on the other end. "Marcus. Good heavens, it's been a while. He's quite busy, but I'll see if he can spare a moment." The waiting stretched, each second taut with an unbearable tension. I could feel the hum intensifying, a faint pressure behind my eyeballs. It felt like the entity was listening, amused. Finally, a deeper, more familiar voice came through the line. "Marcus, is everything all right? We haven't heard from I since. Well, since I moved to that remote island." His tone was genial, but with an underlying current of professional concern. He likely thought I was calling about some obscure data anomaly, a minor glitch. He had no idea. "Professor, it's not all right," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, to inject it with the gravity of my discovery. "I've detected something. A signal from beyond the galactic void. It's structured, ancient, and it's not just information, Professor, it's a correction." I paused, searching for the right words that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a madman. "It's an attempt to rewrite the fundamental constants, to unravel reality itself. It's an entity, Professor, incomprehensible, and it's aware." I could hear the professor breathing, a shallow, measured sound. "Marcus," he said, his voice softening, "I understand you've been working on some truly groundbreaking theories out there. The isolation, the intensity of your research, it can take its toll. Are you getting enough sleep? Are you eating properly?" My grip tightened on the receiver, grip tight. "This isn't about sleep, Professor. This is about everything, about existence. The signal isn't a theory, it's data. I have the data. The patterns are undeniable. It's not just a message, it's an instruction, a reprogramming, and we are the incidental detritus." My voice was rising now, cracking with desperation. "It's going to change things, irreversibly." "Marcus, my friend," the professor said, his tone now a blend of pity and professional detachment. "I truly believe you need a break. Perhaps a sabbatical, away from your instruments, away from the constant pressure. Come back to the mainland, let's talk this through over a proper meal. You've always been prone to intense focus, but this sounds like, well, it sounds like you're under immense stress. No one is rewriting reality, Marcus. That's simply not how physics works." The line went dead. He had hung up. He hadn't believed me. He thought I was breaking. The receiver slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the desk. The hum in my head surged, a deafening roar that swallowed all other sound, then receded to a persistent throb. Could he truly be so blind? Or was I simply failing to convey the absolute, terrifying truth? The air in the lab grew heavy, thick with a scent I couldn't quite place, metallic, yet also like something ancient and desiccated. My vision flickered at the edges, the familiar walls of my sanctuary seeming to shimmer, to blur. I staggered out, needing air, needing to find someone else. Anyone. The island community, ferry only runs once a week, was small, its rhythms dictated by the tides and the occasional arrival of supplies. I walked with a frantic energy, the gravel crunching under my worn boots. The salt spray on my face felt like a slap, a reminder of the solid, tangible world that was slipping away. I found the local constable, a stout man with kind eyes and a perpetually worried frown, in his small office overlooking the harbor. He was filing papers, the scent of stale coffee clinging to the air. "Constable," I gasped, leaning against the doorframe, my chest heaving. "I need to report something catastrophic." He looked up, his brow furrowing deeper. "Marcus, you look unwell. Are you all right, lad?" "No, I'm not all right," I insisted, stepping forward, trying to articulate the impossible. "There's a force, an entity, it's manipulating universal laws, it's going to unravel everything. The sky, the sea, the very ground beneath our feet. It's not a storm, it's not a natural disaster, it's something from outside." I gestured wildly towards the window, towards the vast, indifferent ocean. "It's here, it's already begun." The constable's gaze was steady, but his eyes held a familiar, unsettling pity. "Marcus, I appreciate you coming to me, but universal laws, entities, what exactly are you claiming happened? Did you see something, a foreign vessel, someone tampering with the lighthouse?" He leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped over his belly. "I can't act on abstract theories, Marcus. My jurisdiction is here on the island, practical matters. Vandalism, missing lobster pots, that sort of thing. It's not abstract," I shouted, my voice raw. "It's the ultimate practical matter. It's the end of all practical matters. Don't you feel it, the subtle shift, the way the light seems wrong, the way the air itself feels? We're cut off. If it truly begins, there will be no escape." He sighed, a long, weary sound. "Marcus, you're a brilliant man, everyone says so, but you've been working too hard, up there in that observatory, alone for months. It's not good for a man. I think you need to rest, take a few days off. Maybe catch the next ferry, visit some family on the mainland." He stood up, offering me a glass of water, his movements slow and deliberate, as if dealing with a frightened animal. "There's nothing to report here, Marcus. Just another quiet day on the island." I stared at the water, then back at his placid, uncomprehending face. He saw a man in distress, not a prophet of an impending apocalypse. His practical, grounded world had no space for the cosmic horror I carried. The hum was a dull ache now, a constant reminder. If even the most grounded, most practical minds refused to see, what hope was there for any of us? The gulls cried overhead, their calls sounding strangely mournful, discordant. The waves crashed against the shore with a relentless, hungry rhythm. I was utterly alone. The weight of the ignored warning pressed down on me, suffocating. The world was deaf, blind, and indifferent. It was dying, and no one would believe me. What remained then but to face it alone? If even the most grounded, most practical minds couldn't grasp the precipice we teetered on, what hope remained? The hum, once a sporadic intrusion, had settled into a low thrum beneath my skin, a constant, vibrating companion that muted the sound of the ocean, the cry of gulls, even the thud of my own frantic pulse. It was the sound of something impossibly vast shifting. I walked away from the dock, the wooden planks feeling less solid with each step, the salt air suddenly acrid in my throat. My determination warred with a creeping, visceral nausea. The small island community, ferry only runs once a week, was a place built on routine, on the predictable rhythm of tides and seasons. Now that rhythm felt off. The morning light, usually crisp and clear, seemed to shimmer at the edges like heat haze on a summer road, but the air was cold. A distant horn from a fishing boat sounded wrong, drawn out, then abruptly cut short as if time itself had snagged. I shook my head, blaming my own exhaustion, the relentless stress. I needed to focus. I needed to understand what was happening, even if no one else would. Back in my rented cottage, the silence felt heavier than usual, oppressive. I switched on the old shortwave radio, hoping for some connection to the wider world, a world I suspected was already dissolving. The static was a familiar crackle, then a voice, thin and reedy, speaking of unseasonable fogs blanketing entire cities, fogs that didn't dissipate with the sun. Then another report, a news anchor's voice laced with an almost clinical detachment, describing structures in a major city that had inexplicably altered. Not collapsed, not damaged, but changed. A skyscraper, once a proud rectangle of glass and steel, now featured a spire that twisted into a helix of impossible angles, its apex appearing to bend the light around it. My breath hitched. This was it. The signal was no longer content to merely exist. It was actively reshaping reality. The radio crackled again, a different station, a different voice, panicked this time. Missing entire families, not just here but in coastal towns, inland, everywhere. They just aren't there anymore. No trace, no struggle, just gone. The words were punctuated by a high-pitched wail, then the signal dissolved into a shriek of static that grated on my teeth. I slammed my fist on the table, the old wood groaning in protest. Disappearances. The pattern was emerging, horribly clear. I stumbled outside, the small garden feeling alien. The familiar rose bushes in the neighbor's yard seemed to sag at an unnatural angle, their petals an unnerving shade of deep violet, almost black. The sky above me was a sickly gray, not cloudy, but as if the very fabric of the atmosphere had been stretched thin, diluted. I could feel the hum intensifying, a pressure building behind my eyes, pushing against my skull. A local fisherman, a grizzled man with sun-weathered skin, staggered past my cottage, his eyes wide and unfocused. He mumbled to himself, pointing a trembling finger at the horizon. "The sea. It ain't right, Marcus, it's folding." He didn't elaborate, just kept walking, a slow, shuffling gait towards the empty dock. I watched him go, a shiver tracing a path down my spine. The sea folding, what did that even mean? Later that day, the reports grew more bizarre, more terrifying. Broadcasts spoke of mass psychological distress. Not just panic, but widespread apathy. Entire populations simply ceasing to function, staring blankly at walls or laughing without reason at nothing at all. I saw it in the few islanders still out and about. A shopkeeper, usually bustling, sat behind his counter, slowly polishing the same spot on the countertop over and over, his eyes vacant. A child on the beach, instead of building sandcastles, was meticulously arranging pebbles into a perfect, repeating pattern, her face utterly devoid of expression. I felt the edges of my own sanity fraying. There was the hum doing this. There was it causing these distortions, these unravelings. I stared at my hands, my familiar calloused hands, and for a terrifying second, the lines on my palms seemed to shift, to rearrange themselves into something else, a fleeting glimpse of an impossible geometry, before snapping back into place. The air was thick with an unseen weight, pressing down, distorting. The sun began to set, but the light was wrong. It wasn't the familiar orange and purple of a normal sunset. The sky bled into impossible hues of electric blue and sickly green, the colors swirling and merging in defiance of everything I knew about light, about the spectrum. The horizon line itself seemed to waver, to curve in on itself, as if the very edge of the world was bending. The world was coming undone. What would I see when the sun rose again? The thud of my own blood pulsing in my ears. The hum had not merely settled, it had fused, becoming the very rhythm of my awareness, a constant, low thrum beneath my skin that vibrated through bone and sinew. It muted the sound of the ocean, the cry of gulls, even the frantic drumming of my heart. Everything was a dull, distant echo compared to the internal resonance. I was no longer just hearing the hum. I was feeling it, an all-encompassing vibration that made the world shimmer at its edges. My vision blurred, not from fatigue, but from an unsettling hyperclarity. The air in my small dwelling on this isolated island community, where the ferry only runs once a week, seemed to thicken, to take on a granular quality I could almost taste. The scent of salt and damp earth, usually so comforting, now carried a faint, metallic tang like old blood. Every surface I touched felt subtly wrong: the rough wood of the table, the cool ceramic of a forgotten mug, the worn fabric of my shirt, all vibrating with a frequency that wasn't their own. My hands, once precise and steady, now trembled with an insistent tremor, less a sign of fear and more a symptom of being retuned. Sleep offered no respite. My dreams were not dreams but extensions of this new awareness, swirling vortexes of impossible geometry, whispers that coiled around the edges of my perception. I saw not with my eyes but with some deeper, more fundamental part of my being. The world was peeling back, revealing the skeletal structure beneath. The solid seemed porous, the fixed in flux. I could almost perceive the energetic dance of atoms, the invisible currents that wove through everything, but it was corrupted, distorted by the constant hum. It was like seeing the world through a broken lens, where every angle was slightly off, every curve subtly wrong. Then the full clarity came. It wasn't a gradual shift. It was an abrupt, shattering revelation, as if a veil had been ripped away by invisible hands. I was staring at the wall of my study, the familiar peeling paint, the worn timber. But then the wall began to breathe. Not literally, not like a living thing, but its very substance seemed to undulate, to expand and contract in ways that defied visual logic. Edges folded into themselves. Lines that should have been parallel converged at impossible vanishing points. And colors shifted through hues I had no names for, not quite red, not quite violet, but something utterly alien and primary. It was in that moment, as the reality of my room warped and writhed before me, that I saw it. Not an image projected, not a shadow cast, but an intrinsic truth woven into existence itself. The entity. It wasn't a creature in any sense I understood. It had no discernible form, no head, no limbs, no defined boundaries. It was a structure, a colossal non-Euclidean construct of pure thought and will, manifested as an absence, a twisting, self-devouring geometry that filled the void between everything. My breath hitched, a ragged rasp in my throat. My body locked, muscles seizing, a deep, primal revulsion seizing me. This wasn't something to fear in the traditional sense. It was something to be unmade by. It was a fundamental violation of perception. My mind screamed against the impossible angles, the dimensions that folded back on themselves, the sheer, crushing weight of its sheer wrongness. It was like trying to comprehend a color that didn't exist, or a sound that was also a taste. The hum wasn't just a signal, it was a blueprint. The entity wasn't here to communicate, or to conquer, or even to destroy in a vengeful way. It was here to correct existence itself. My mind, now stripped bare of its protective filters, understood its purpose with horrifying clarity. We, all of us, everything we knew, every law of physics, every fundamental constant, were merely errors in a grand, cosmic equation. The entity perceived existence as a flawed calculation, an elegant but ultimately incorrect solution to a problem we couldn't even fathom. Its presence, its very being, was an act of recalibration. It wasn't malicious, it was indifferent. Like a programmer debugging a faulty code, it was systematically unraveling the universe, line by line, constant by constant, to rewrite the very definitions of reality according to its own alien, perfect logic. Our sun, our planet, our lives, our hopes, our fears, all of it was an anomaly to be smoothed out, a deviation to be corrected. I felt a scream tear through my throat, but no sound escaped. My vision swam, not from blurring but from the overwhelming data, the absolute, undeniable truth of what I was witnessing. My body convulsed, a violent tremor that shook me to my core. My teeth chattered, my skin prickled with an icy sweat, and my stomach churned, threatening to expel what little I had eaten. The sheer, colossal scale of its indifference was more terrifying than any imagined wrath. We were not even insects to be crushed. We were simply incorrect data points. What could possibly stand against a correction of existence itself? I stood on the rocky shore of the island community. Ferry only runs once a week, the salt spray a faint memory on my lips, overwhelmed by this internal resonance. My determination, a brittle shield against the encroaching chaos, now felt like a fragile shell. The world around me seemed to hold its breath, caught in the same silent thrum. The gulls, usually raucous, wheeled in slow, unnaturally quiet circles. The waves, which had crashed with relentless power moments before, now merely sighed against the shingle, their foamy edges dissolving into something too smooth, too perfect. It was as if the very air had thickened, becoming a medium through which sound struggled to travel. I noticed a peculiar shimmer in my peripheral vision, a distortion that wasn't quite heat haze, but more like the world itself was being viewed through imperfect glass. My breath hitched. The air, though seemingly still, carried a faint, coppery tang, sharp and metallic like fresh blood on the tongue, yet without any source. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see them tremble, but they were unnervingly steady. It was my perception that wavered, not my physical form. The lines on my palm seemed to deepen, then blur, then sharpen again, as if redrawn by an invisible hand. The individual strands of hair on my arm stood out with impossible clarity, each follicle a tiny, distinct crater on my skin. This hyperclarity was a fresh torment, making every imperfection, every minute detail screamed for attention. I walked, or rather I drifted towards the small cluster of buildings that made up the island community. The general store, usually bustling with a few locals, was eerily still. The red paint on its facade, once vibrant, now pulsed with a deep, bruised purple, shifting subtly with each beat of the internal hum. The wood of the door frame seemed to soften, its grain becoming fluid, rippling like water under a stone. I reached out a hand, my fingers brushing against the surface. It was no longer wood, but something yielding and cool, like damp clay, yet it held its form. My stomach clenched. A figure emerged from the doorway of the small post office, the clerk. Their gait was no longer a shuffle, but a series of precise, almost mechanical movements. Their head tilted at an angle that seemed to defy anatomical possibility. Their eyes, usually a watery blue, were now flat obsidian discs that reflected nothing. They didn't acknowledge me, didn't seem to see me, but moved with an unnerving purpose towards the shore. The clerk's skin, I noted with a rising wave of nausea, was losing its texture, becoming uniformly smooth like polished stone. Not scarred, not aged, simply blank. Panic began to claw at my throat. This wasn't destruction. It was something far worse. It was redefinition. The very essence of things was being rewritten silently, utterly. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me, not with weight, but with an incomprehensible pressure of presence. I could feel it, an immense, indifferent will that was simply acting. I stumbled to the edge of the small dock, the wooden planks beneath my feet groaning. Or perhaps it was my own bones protesting the sight before me. The ocean stretched out, vast and unknowable, but it was no longer blue. It was a shifting tapestry of impossible colors, emeralds that burned with an inner fire, violets that drank the light, and shades I had no names for, all swirling together in a slow, deliberate dance. The surface was not liquid, not solid, but something in between, a viscous, churning expanse that reflected the sky like a shattered mirror, and the sky. The sky was the worst. The sun, a familiar golden orb, had not vanished. Instead, it was elongating, stretching into an impossible ellipse, its light no longer warm, but a searing, sterile white that bleached the world of all color save for the ocean's impossible hues. The clouds, once fluffy white, had unraveled into long, fibrous strands, like sinews pulled taut across a vast, cosmic loom. They weren't moving, they were forming. And through these fibrous strands I could see something else. Not stars, not galaxies, but vast, geometric patterns, immense and cold, slowly rotating like the gears of some unimaginable clockwork mechanism. They were not distant, they were there, etched into the fabric of the firmament, close enough to feel their incomprehensible scale. A small fishing boat, usually bobbing gently, was now motionless, frozen in the viscous ocean. The fisherman who had been casting his nets just hours ago was still aboard, but his form was no longer human. He was a composition of angles and planes, his limbs elongated into sharp, crystalline structures, his head a faceted prism that refracted the alien sunlight into 1,000 sterile rainbows. He was not screaming, he was not moving. He was simply there, an integral part of the new, terrible landscape. This was the correction, not an ending, but a re-beginning, stripped of all warmth, all familiarity. It was the universe being tidied, reordered into a sterile, indifferent logic. My skin crawled, not from cold, but from the horrifying realization that my own atoms, my very being, were subject to this same silent decree. My breath came in ragged gasps. The air, thin and metallic, offered no comfort. My vision swam, not from tears, but from the sheer, overwhelming wrongness of it all. The island community, ferry only runs once a week, my temporary refuge, was dissolving into a mosaic of alien geometries and impossible colors. The familiar became the monstrous, without a sound, without a struggle. Would I, too, become an angle, a plane, a refracted prism of indifference? I stood on the rocky shore of the island community. Ferry only runs once a week, the pebbles cold and sharp beneath my worn boots. But the cold was an echo, a memory. The hum was the only true sensation now, a resonant frequency that seemed to rewrite the very texture of the air around me. My vision shimmered at the edges. The familiar gray-green of the sea started to bleed into a deeper, impossible indigo, like ink dropped into a vast, shallow basin. The sky, a bruised pewter just moments ago, now pulsed with faint, internal light, as if the sun had been swallowed and was struggling to escape from within the clouds. I lifted a hand, my fingers feeling heavy, distantly connected to my will. Was this merely my perception fracturing, or was the world itself beginning to unravel, thread by meticulous thread? The ground beneath my feet was no longer solid rock. It was still hard, still angular, but there was a subtle give, a silent flex that resonated with the hum. I knelt, pressing my palm to a granite slab. The stone was cool, yes, but it also felt porous, almost spongy, like dried coral that had forgotten its purpose. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through it, not from the earth but from the pervasive hum. It was as if the very atoms of the island were being rearranged, tuned to a new, alien chord. I pushed harder, feeling the resistance but also the strange compliance. What was happening to the bedrock? I looked out at the ocean, that vast, indifferent expanse that had always been a constant. The indigo deepened, becoming absolute black at the horizon, a line that no longer seemed distant but utterly flat, a painted backdrop. A faint phosphorescence, not of algae or plankton but of something deeper, more fundamental, began to bloom beneath the surface. It wasn't light, not truly. The water felt thinner, less wet. Had the sea itself forgotten how to be water? A strange, crystalline structure began to coalesce on the distant horizon, rising from the inky blackness. It wasn't a cloud, nor a mountain. It was an edifice of pure geometry, impossible angles meeting in impossible spaces, glinting with the same internal luminescence that now stained the sky. It grew with a glacial slowness, silent and inexorable, stretching upwards, then outwards, consuming the horizon. My mind tried to grasp its form, to categorize it, but my thoughts slid away like water on polished glass. It was not built. It was manifesting. It was the architecture of an idea, given form, and it was radiating the hum, amplifying it until my teeth ached and my vision swam. Was this the correction I had inadvertently called forth? My breath hitched. My lungs burned, not from exertion but from the sheer wrongness of the air. It was heavy, thick with the resonating hum, difficult to draw in, as if I were breathing liquid. My body trembled, a raw, primal fear seizing me, but it was a fear that felt increasingly distant, muffled by the relentless thrum. My hands, once capable of fine adjustments to delicate instruments, now felt clumsy, alien. I wanted to run, to scream, but the hum had woven itself into my motor functions, slowing them, distorting them. Every instinct urged flight, but my legs were rooted, heavy, as if becoming part of the shifting earth. What if there was nowhere left to run to? Then the stars appeared. Not the familiar pinpricks of light in a velvet sky, but vast, swirling nebulae, their colors vibrant and terrible, visible in the full, strange daylight. They were not distant suns, they were patterns, luminous fractals that unfolded across the sky, stretching from zenith to horizon, ignoring the very concept of atmosphere or distance. They were too close. They were inside the sky, not beyond it. The hum intensified, a symphony of impossible frequencies. This wasn't the universe I knew. The signal hadn't been a discovery, it had been an invitation, or perhaps a command. I was not an observer. I was merely a participant in its final, terrifying manifestation. My own existence felt like a brief, flickering anomaly in the face of this absolute, fundamental rewrite. Had I simply been a key, a mechanism to unlock this new order? My thoughts began to unravel, not into madness, but into a strange, unsettling clarity. The entity wasn't a being in the way I understood it. It was the hum. It was the correction. It was the new fundamental law asserting itself, erasing the old, messy, vibrant reality and replacing it with something ordered, absolute, and utterly alien. My work, my ambition, my very life had been a single infinitesimal ripple in an ocean that was now becoming something else entirely. I was dissolving not into death but into integration. The hum was no longer in me. I was becoming of the hum. My memories, my identity, the face of my colleagues, the taste of salt on the air, the warmth of the sun, they were all becoming distant echoes, dissolving into the pervasive thrum. My understanding was becoming its understanding, and its understanding had no room for me. The crystalline structures on the horizon had now reached the shore, not crashing but simply existing where the water had been. The air itself was now a resonant chamber, vibrating with a frequency that was both sound and light and pure, unadulterated thought. My body, once a vessel of flesh and bone, felt like a tuning fork, resonating with the new reality. My vision, once limited by human biology, now perceived layers of information, patterns within patterns, geometries that defied all previous logic. The indigo sea, the pulsating sky, the crystalline shore, they were not separate entities but facets of a single, unified, humming presence. I was no longer Marcus. What remained of my perception was merely a fleeting, final glimpse of a universe that had never truly existed, now overwritten by the true, absolute order. Was this the oblivion I had feared, or something infinitely more terrible?